It's not about looking at just the one class. It's looking at everything else.
Yep.
Rent control doesn't work. In fact, rent control produces the opposite effects of everything they're trying to do. So remember...
Welcome to Stewardology, a podcast where two worlds collide. In this show, financial advisor Tim Russell and Pastor Drew Gysi are joined by me, producer Tyler Rutherford, to explore the intersection of financial stewardship and theology. Their unique perspectives help Christians and churches understand and apply a biblical framework for everyday financial decisions so Christians everywhere can grow in their walk with Christ through biblical stewardship. Before we get started, we just wanted you to know that the topics discussed in this podcast are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific investment advice or recommendations. Investment and investment strategies involve risk, including the potential loss of principal, and past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Securities and advisory services are offered through Genius Wealth Management, member FINRA, and SIPC. Without further ado, here are your hosts, Tim Russell, Drew Gysi, and Tyler Rutherford.
Welcome to the Stewardology Podcast. My name is Tim Russell, and I am here with my co-host. Believe it or not, Drew is back again. Second time in a row.
I am here.
Cancer didn't keep him down. He's here.
Not doing that.
And Tyler Rutherford.
Hey, everybody.
And we are talking about rent control. Rent control is the idea that we can control the price of rents to help people find housing more affordable because we care about people so much. We will not allow those evil landlords to raise those rents and all of the rest. Because nothing bad ever happened when the government controlled the price of a particular thing. Nothing bad ever happened.
Yeah, so welcome back to our second of 4 weeks where we're diving into some economic policy. It's kind of fun.
I was waiting for that.
This is actually going to be really fun.
Yeah.
I was waiting for that lightning bolt to come down when Tim was just talking moments ago.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It is a thing. So here's the thing. You know, we've all heard the frustration. There's skyrocketing housing costs. It's hitting families. Families are finding it harder to afford to find a reasonable place to live for the size of the family that they have. And so the government decides to step in and we're going to help. We're going to be the good big brother. We're going to help out the little brother, and we're going to lock rents down so they cannot rise with the market so that we can solve the problem of affordability. The challenge is that history and economics shows that when the government steps in to heavily control any sector, to control any price, the availability of the price drops, the quality of the supply suffers, and the prices end up rising in the long term. We're going to talk about that all today. Think about the U.S. Postal Service, right? There's an example of government controlling monopoly over a particular good or service. It's the U.S. Postal Service. And maybe we think about the Affordable Care Act. All of these things are examples that show us, look, government getting involved doesn't make it more affordable. Just saying it's affordable healthcare doesn't make it affordable.
You keep using that word.
It less. Yeah, you keep on using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. That's not that's not how the word works, buddy. You can't just say affordable and it all of a sudden becomes affordable.
I didn't say it. I declared it.
I'm gonna start saying that more and more in our seminars. It's affordable.
No, but this is an important conversation to have because you might think, okay, this is the Stewardology podcast where we talk about theology and money. Why are we talking about like some economic policy on here? Well, the reality is God has called you to be a wise steward of all that he has entrusted to you.
Yep.
And the reality is the more that we can keep into your care, right, through maybe free market values and policies that allow you to be the manager and allow you to be the steward of what you have made financially, I think we can see a better kingdom impact here on earth.
Preach it, brother.
While the Lord tarries. So that's why we're talking about economic policy and what we think is best or maybe better for Christians to operate here in the United States, at least. So
yeah, fantastic. So let's start out the conversation with Henry Hazlitt. Henry Hazlitt is a great resource. If you have not read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, what are you waiting for? Go buy this book today. It's a fantastic resource, and I will give you the one lesson in one sentence right now, okay? The whole of economics can be reduced to one single lesson, and that lesson can be reduced to one single sentence. What's that sentence? The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the long-term effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracking the consequences of that policy, not merely for one group, but for all groups. Mm-hmm. If we could get that lesson in our minds, socialism would be done. Communism would be a thing of the past, and we would, frankly, be in a utopian society. Capitalism. Actually and truly, I do believe capitalism brings about the most human flourishing, even on the lower end of the income scale. There is far more quality of life for the average quote-unquote poor person today than there ever was in any socialist utopia, depends on your perspective. All right, so you got that lesson, right? So let me just summarize it, right? So we've got to look at not just who we're trying to help and say this policy is good, this economic deal is a good deal because it helps poor people who can't afford the rent. Just because you try to help them doesn't make it good policy. You have to look at all of the ripple down effects, because economics is ultimately a study of choices. Because every single person in the entire economy will change their behavior, will change their choices based on the incentives that the policies create. So today, what I'd like to do is dive into rent control. Let's look at what are the incentives that rent control is creating all the way through, as much as we can see, the economic structure, all the different actors and the economic incentives that are in place. And we can then logically see how this policy works as people respond to the incentives that are presented to them.
Yeah, so let's dive in and talk about it. Does it really help people flourish, or does it cause bigger problems? So let's say we're in Blue Fork City, okay? Fictional scenario, Blue Fork City. It's in the American continental Northeast. I want the government to take over rent. I want to have them lock in my rent, control it. What happens now?
So here's the thing. Let's kind of dig through what are the incentives that we're creating. Well, automatically, when we create rent controls, there are two groups of people that are immediately potentially benefited. Number one are the current renters. Those who are in a rental environment. Rent controls will say your rents cannot increase more than a certain amount per year. Could be a fixed dollar amount, could be a fixed percentage rate, but that is the maximum any landlord could raise the rent on any tenant. So, okay, that's the first class. Second class is individuals who are trying to get into a rental. Maybe they're home creation. They're leaving one apartment, going to another. They're leaving their mom and dad's house or their basement or whatever and getting their own place. They're getting married and they're creating their own family. They're having a baby and need a bigger place. We need to rent. And they're going to be benefited because the entrance price for that said apartment is fixed. It can't go higher than a certain amount. So let's think about incentives. Incentive number one is that the individual is obligated or not obligated, they're incentivized to buy more of a thing at a lower price. That's how economics works. It's all about supply and demand. It's about price. And if you have fixed the price low and you come into the market, you're going to buy more than you otherwise would because you can afford it. So maybe you'll get a bigger apartment than you had available, if you can even find one. That's the challenge. Second incentive is for the person in that apartment. They will not leave the apartment because the equivalent rents around them have, been maybe raised at a different rate, and they couldn't afford to go from apartment A to apartment B. So what that means is that you have an individual who had a 3-bedroom apartment that's now down to only 1 bedroom being used because their kids have moved out of the home, but they are not incentivized to move out. So therefore, it is an inefficient use of that apartment because one person or 2 people living in a 3-bedroom apartment is not a good use of that, and they're not going to bring in other people into that apartment complex. So we have incentive structures that are a problem. Well, let's also think about negative incentives. Well, on the negative side, we have another party involved. That's the owner of the property, the landlord. And if rent controls means that they can't raise their rents, even if they have to reno and turn over that apartment after someone leaves, they can't afford to replace the appliances. They can't afford to paint the walls. They can't afford to fix the plumbing. They can't afford to do regular maintenance and upkeep on the property. So you know what happens? They're incentivized to reduce their investment into the apartment. The quality goes down. Things stop working because they can't economically afford to replace it because they're not going to be compensated through the rent for the added capital to that place. In fact, then what we find is not only does quality decrease, but quantity decreases. Mm-hmm. Well, again, what is the incentive for the landlord? If you've got an apartment unit that is no longer fit for human habitation, the last people who lived there destroyed the property in one way or another, and it's going to cost them $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to turn that over, but they can only raise their rents $100 a month. It's going to take them $100 a month. That's $1,200 a year. Times, divide that by $50,000. It's going to take them nearly 50 years to recoup that. And how many times is the apartment going to turn over within those 50 years? How many additional $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 investments are they going to need to do? Mm-hmm. The landlord would rather take no income than a loss of income. So they would rather let that apartment go unrented. In fact, this is currently what we're seeing in the city of New York. We have enough excess capacity in the housing market that's simply unrented because the landlords can't afford to rent it because of rent controls that forces, we could house every single homeless person in New York City for all of the vacant apartments that are currently there. There's, I think, 35% of the potential real estate market is just totally off of the market because it's not being rented at all.
Not that I totally trust Google and what they say, but what they're saying as of today, approximately 50 to 60,000 vacant rent-stabilized apartments are in New York City that are currently off the market. People cannot go in. 50 to 60,000. Yeah. That's a staggering number.
So remember the incentives. The landlord is not incentivized to improve the quality, so quality declines. And they are not incentivized to produce the quantity, therefore the amount declines. And a second factor is building of new units. There is no economic incentive to build subsidized housing because of all of those factors. Therefore, there is no additional investment into the stock of housing, which leads to further interesting incentives. Thomas Sowell, and I don't know why this man hasn't been given the Congressional Medal of Honor and all of the rest. I think Thomas Sowell is an American treasure, and everyone needs to read, love, and enjoy Thomas Sowell. I don't know how we allow any high school graduate to graduate without having read at least some of Thomas Sowell, because he's an absolute treasure. Have I said enough yet? Read Thomas Sowell. Everything he wrote, read it all.
I'm glad he didn't say to get a job with the Life Financial
Well, that's the
Group.
next step. If you're going to keep your job, next pay raise, you've got to at least read one Thomas Sowell book. All right, so back to Thomas Sowell. He talks about the consequences of price controls for rent leads to three things. He says it leads to shortages and quality reductions. And the third thing, we've already talked about those two things. The third thing is a black market. It leads to a black market.
Define that, please.
Well, so here's the thing. When the difference between the legal price and the price that people are willing to pay is large enough, the compensate risks for breaking the law is not enough to keep people from bribing landlords or bribing superintendents or supers, right, for apartment units to be able to get into units and pay a higher price. It's a black market. In fact, one of the things that I thought was so interesting is it says that Thomas Sowell here in the book talks about the increase, that one of the crazy realities is that there is actually in New York City a net increase in rent costs after rent controls went in. This is part of the other kind of negative reality. So if you are a developer, you are not going to develop rent subsidized housing or rent controlled housing because you can't afford to do it. So what are you going to do? The luxury market is not controlled or regulated by rent controls. Therefore, the only supply that comes to the market is in the luxury space. So the net rents for luxury are higher than low income. So if you take all of the rents paid and divide it by all of the tenants, what we find is that the net rent, the average rent, actually goes up in rent subsidized housing because the amount of people that can get into lower quality, lower number of rent controlled units is less than what ends up coming on the market in the luxury market.
But Tim, I thought this was all about helping the poor.
Do you remember the first lesson of economics? Economics in one lesson? It's not about looking at just the one class. It's looking at everything else.
Yep.
Rent control doesn't work. Mm-hmm. In fact, rent control produces the opposite effects of everything they're trying to do. So remember last week's episode. Remember when we were talking about the way that socialism seeks to move towards, essentially, its trajectories towards communism, where the state owns everything. And I said socialism doesn't work, and it's a feature, not a bug, because at the end of the day, they want to privatize all ownership. It's not an accident that Mondami's housing czar is a avowed communist and believes that private property rights, owning of real estate, is some kind of white supremacist evil that needs to be abolished, and we need to come to a public ownership of all of the assets or all of the real estate because socialism doesn't work. Therefore, the government will put up its own housing. Now we have the inculcation of slums. Not owned by private renters or owned by private landlords who are incentivized to keep and maintain those properties at a wise, safe, and sustainable level. No, we've got the government who will only put as much as they can into those properties to keep the people from crying too much.
The bare minimum, if that.
The bare minimum. And
or nothing.
So again, it's a feature, not a bug. So we're creating more slums, and we're creating the environment where, because the system doesn't work, because there's so much inequity, which is a feature, they're going to then create even more inequity by taking all property away from individuals. Rent control is just one step along the pathway to serfdom, to slavery to the economic overlords.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the next point we have in here is that when you introduce rent control, obviously the free market is restricted. And you've already talked about a few of those points. But what's interesting is when you allow the market to kind of go and do its thing, and you allow the landlords, you give them the incentives to like make it nice, like make it livable, make it an attractive offer to a potential renter, and more people get in on this because it's a profitable business. Higher supply and competition will lead to better quality housing and more options, and therefore putting downward pressure on prices. So yeah, the rent control thing might feel, and I use feel intentionally here, might feel like a Band-Aid or a solution to a problem in the short term, but in reality, the real solution to drive down prices is more competition, meaning the market needs to be opened up for that freedom of commerce to do what they feel like they need to do to open it up, right? I mean, it makes sense.
This is the reality of incentives. Rent control creates perverse incentives. The elimination of rent control, you allow a free market to work, you create positive incentives. Number one, you create an incentive for families to use only the amount of housing that they need. So the scenario where an individual doesn't move out of an apartment or a unit because they can't, they're getting such a good deal that, moving into something less large would not be incentivized for them. In the free market environment, they would be incentivized to get a lower cost apartment that's smaller for them. All of that works.
I have a question, and it's kind of a tangent, but thinking about our current, the housing market, what are your thoughts on the Fed? So if there are people that own houses that would want to move, but they feel like they have to keep their low interest rate and can't afford to go.
I've talked to many these last months on the road that are operating off of a 2.75 to
they don't want to jump to
low
a 6.
4s, and they don't want to jump into the 6, 7s. So they're saying, I got to stay put.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yes.
is the Fed's function there to manage those rates let's call it a violation of the free market in some respect? What are your thoughts on that?
That's interesting.
There's a way in which it was creating artificially low interest rates for a while, and that was dangerous. And we kind of saw it coming, that this was going to create an incentive where someone wasn't going to want to leave. So the creation of incentives is in and of itself not necessarily a problem.
Sure.
Right? And having low interest rates are not in and of itself a problem. The reason why there's not more supply is really because of the broader regulatory environment around the creation of new housing units. The lot size requirements, or all of the zoning requirements to be able to, get the stormwater taken care of, or, the septic system, or hooking up to the sewer, or, getting this permit from this department, and that permit from this department, and that permit from over here, and getting them all to cooperate. It's so onerous and restrictive that people don't want to build more housing because they value tree frogs over humans. Therefore, because of the regulatory system, because of the too much big government, more than interest rates keeps the housing supply low. And that's why me and all of the other free market guys that really believe in the limiting of the size and the scope of government, it's critical for us to roll back all of these draconian rules and regulations that prevent free people from exercising their own human autonomy to create human flourishing and provide products, services, and housing that we need. If we had more housing supply coming onto the market, the fact that people were holding on to I don't know that that's artificial. There are low interest rates. Frankly, it's a good thing for them to do that, but it wouldn't be a problem if we had more supply coming into the market.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that would help with the rent issue too, because if there's more homes on the market to buy or to invest in to be a landlord and to rent out. There's more competition, which puts downward pressure on prices. So yeah, freeing up the market, getting rid of those regulations would help a ton, not adding regulations.
So one of the other things I think that are the implications or the effects, maybe I'll say the effects of rent control, is the creating of ghetto communities. When we have rent-controlled areas, it disincentivizes other good investments within the community, like other businesses or stores coming into that environment. For whatever reason, businesses don't like that. I don't know, it's probably because there's more crime in those areas. There's higher costs of operating a business with a lot of shoplifting or a lot of other kinds of violent acts. So we see often in cities businesses shuttering stores and moving out because it's not affordable for them to operate the businesses in those environments.
Or they lock down their products. I was just out in San Francisco, served a church out in there, and had to do a quick run into a CVS, and I have never seen this before, but everything was behind glass. You had to get somebody there to actually get something out, and they kind of walked you up to the register.
Yeah.
And this is their way of, it's costing them more to be able to provide and take care of their community. And some smaller mom and pop shops heave-ho out of there because of that.
Well, and costs go up because all of that extra security costs more, and the cost of the good and the service is reflected in the price of that good or the service.
I've paid more for just regular over-the-counter decongestant there than I have ever paid for in my life.
Thank you, socialism. Capitalism, that's not a result of capitalism. It's not.
No, I agree.
It's all about the incentives. You don't favor the one at the expense of the other. You don't just consider the benefits to one community without thinking about the other effects of everyone else within the entire economy.
Yeah.
That is why rent controls are frankly evil things, because they restrict human freedom. They set prices artificially low, and just because you say it should only cost X number of dollars to live in a place doesn't mean it actually costs X number of dollars to provide that living place. The cost of inflation is a reality, and landlords must bear the cost of inflation, and if they can't pass the cost on to the landlords, they're going to get out of the business of being a landlord. Therefore, housing goes down. All of it's about incentives.
Yeah, and think about the small landlords too. Like we'll categorize as like small business landlords. The entrepreneurial investors in a community, you're going to see less of them because they're not just going to take this with all the rent controls. They're going to sell their property, get out. Now you're going to have the big institutions. They're going to come in and buy instead. And so it's just ironic.
Or the state.
Or the state. But the problem is that smaller investor will probably have difficulty selling what they have because it is not well maintained and well kept.
Yeah.
That's the domino effect there.
It's this downward spiral. And what I find ironic about it is the people that would be all gung-ho about rent control, they're for the little guys and they just want to stick it to the big corporations, the big institutions. In reality, this is only going to help them. Maybe that's the wrong way to say it, but it's not going to help the small guy perhaps as much as they want to. And more of the benefit is just going to go to the institutions that can afford to just like drop the cash on it.
Which, again, leads towards the communization of all things.
Yeah.
And increases the classes, the perceived struggle between classes, the owner class versus the renter class. Mm-hmm. And when we start viewing people in terms of their class or their status, that's where you get more of this struggle and fight, which ultimately potentially could lead towards some revolution or civil war or massive civil unrest. And this is all intentional. It is a feature and not a bug of socialism. It's a feature, not a bug of rent control. Again, it's evil. It needs to, in every iteration, be stomped out. Free markets need to be set free. Markets need to be set free so that they are free markets. and that includes renting. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have wise and prudent regulations over how rents are to be handled, how rental units are to be handled. But again, remember the size and the scope of government, frankly, needs to be significantly reduced, because that's ultimately going to be better for the economy and for the average individual than a large, inefficient government, which we will get into in our next video.
What I find interesting about this topic is you might sit back and say, oh, rent control is just one of the many, economic policies. How much could this really impact things? But when you sit down, like we've done in this conversation, and you explore the logical conclusions of these economic policies, you really can see how they can be damaging and what second, third, and fourth order effects things like this have. So at the very, very least, you as the listener, me as even a co-host learning about this stuff, take all of this and internalize it. And when you're thinking about economic policy, do the research on what are the second, third, and fourth order effects, because it might be more surprising than you think. It's not as short-term as you might expect it to be, or at least what the media pundits and politicians might pitch it to be, right? When they're trying to sell you on something, they're trying to sell you on just the benefits. They're not going to walk you down.
First order.
Yeah, first order benefits. They're not going to walk you down how this is going to affect things in the long run.
And to them, the politician, they're only looking at that first order because it makes them look good, but they're not looking at that domino effect down the road. And I think that's a very important point that you brought up.
Yeah, actually, I have a good quote on that here.
And what book is that, Tim?
So this is Thomas Sowell's Applied Economics, Thinking Beyond Stage 1, right? That's the first, second, third order effects.
Oh, Thinking Beyond Stage. So is there a book prior to that? The Stage 1 book?
Well, yeah. So the Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. It's a much thicker book. I decided not to bring that one
So
down
which one do I need to read to keep my job?
Honestly, probably none of these. I have a couple others I might suggest, but let me get to my point. Those who not think beyond stage 1 find rent controls especially attractive because the good effects come immediately, while the bad effects come later and persist for decades or even generations.
Ooh.
Wow.
And I think that is why we really need to think about those consequences. Think about the long order consequences, not just the immediate benefits of helping just a few individuals afford rent, but what it means to society long term when we disincentivize ownership, disincentivize investment, disincentivize building and capital creation. It actually hurts all people, renters and owners alike.
I mentioned in the beginning of this episode that we are stewards of everything that God has entrusted to us. And Psalm 24 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. It's God's, and we are managers. We're entrusted with a stewardship responsibility. So why is all of this important? Why is this conversation about rent control an important one to have? Well, simply put, if there are policies or politicians that we can support to make sure that more of God's resources end up back in his people's hands and ultimately in kingdom work, that's what we're trying to accomplish and do. And we're also trying to create and encourage you to think more critically about the things that you hear in media, online, because there are multiple effects to these things. And it's important as stewards, as wise managers, that we understand these things and don't blindly walk into and say, rent control is a great idea, right? Among other things. We have to think critically as managers of what God has put into our care.
Yeah, good points. All right, guys. Until next time, take care, God bless, and please stay away from rent control.
Thanks for joining us on the Stewardology Podcast, where financial stewardship and theology meet. We'd like to help you take your next steps in biblical financial stewardship. Subscribe in your podcast provider to get the newest episode delivered to you every week. Leave a 5-star rating and review to help new listeners find the show. Take advantage of your free personal stewardship review at stewardologypodcast.com/review. Be sure to follow us on social media and visit our website at stewardologypodcast.com for tons of free resources and hundreds of free episodes. You can also leave episode ideas at stewardologypodcast.com/idea. Remember, Psalm 20, verse 7, some trust in chariots and some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. See you next week.